Basically, it is urgent.
Yeah.
The urgency has not gone away. However, I, as president, need to allow for the process to take its place before ramming something through to a final vote.
Well, that's Seattle City Council President Sarah Nelson talking to me about the urgency of passing legislation to modify app-based delivery driver wages. But turning this law into reality has faced a number of delays. What is the council's next move on this? Plus, why are businesses in West Seattle speaking out about light rail expansion? And why are city light rates taking a significant jump over the next few years? Well, we are discussing these questions and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are all mine. I am back with my co-host, David Croman. And David, great to be with you once again, and I so enjoy your social media posts. I really need you, though, to explain the one to me where you were waiting at the veterinarian's office because they were x-raying a chicken.
I took my dog in because he had a little bit of a limp, and they were running about a half hour behind. And when the vet came in, she said, "Sorry, but we're delayed. I was x-raying a chicken," which... as the owner of a couple chickens, I promise I will never bring one of them to the vet. They will be soup before they ever go to the vet.
That sounds like a smart way to do it. I'm glad the dog's all right, the chicken's okay, apparently, and we're back to normal here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. A special thanks to our show patrons, and a shout-out I wanted to give to Carl, who's been asking some really good questions about what's going on in Seattle city politics. Carl, appreciate the questions, appreciate the support too. Patrons get all sorts of benefits, access to Patrons First podcast before anybody else. We answer your questions on the show. You even get an awesome Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. How about that? So find the podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of this podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do it. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I wanted to dive into a piece you wrote recently in the Seattle Times about the app-based delivery driver wages the council has been working on. When I talked to Council President Nelson this past week on Council Edition on Seattle Channel, she was saying a few different things like, I need to check with Councilmember Wu, whom the head of ethics and elections said should probably not vote on this measure due to a family connection she has to a restaurant that uses an app-based delivery service. The council president was also throwing out some new numbers regarding where the wage could possibly be set, indicating she might have some agreement with the app companies. But I guess in the end, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing a few months now since this legislation made it out of committee, and it really feels like it's in limbo now. You wrote in your piece that this legislation isn't technically dead, so is it in a coma, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I would say its medical state is worse than limbo. I think a lot of people think it is dead. There is a more optimistic take who want to see this passed, but I'm hearing more and more from people in those rooms that just feel like it's not going to end up moving forward. That could change. I want to caveat it's not a final product, but really, what's happening here is the companies have a number of how high they're willing to go, and a couple council members,
Moore and Hollingsworth, right? And without those two votes,
there's not enough to pass what the companies are willing to do, and so
they've got 4 votes, but not 5.
Yeah, and so I wanted to talk about that, kind of who is going to be a swing vote on this, because it isn't going to be a unanimous decision from the council. How do you see that breaking down in terms of who's voting for what on this? Do you have a sense of that?
I think the only way I could see this moving forward is if Hollingsworth and Moore basically back off with their most recent proposal. I think the real sticking point is the per mile reimbursement rate, which is basically what drivers get to cover things like wear and tear and gas. The original proposal was 33%, I think, and
33 cents.
Moore and Hollingsworth, 33 cents. Yeah, excuse me. Moore and Hollingsworth are pushing for 67 cents, which is the IRS standard.
Right.
And if you work for, your company and they send you out to do an errand, they would pay you 67 cents a mile for reimbursement. That, I think, for the companies is a non-starter. And so that really, I think, is where the rock and a hard place is. And again, I think the companies are fairly firm that they will not agree to lower their fees with what's on the table from Moore and Hollingsworth.
So I guess the question is, do Moore and Hollingsworth care enough about this that they want to push something through and get it passed?
Right now, they feel pretty good about where they stand, and they think it's a good number. And so the result is just week after week comes and goes, and nothing gets passed. And, as of right now, I think the expectations are it will not pass.
Wow, that's a lot to take in here. Let me move on with you if I could, because I wanted to check in on something the Land Use Committee was doing this week. This, of course, chaired by Councilmember Tammy Morales. She's hosting a presentation from 3 organizations who are getting funding from the Equitable Development Initiative, EDI, which, as everybody may recall, was a bit under fire over Memorial Day weekend. That's when Councilmember Maritza Rivera introduced an amendment that would have put a hold on $25 million allocated for EDI, a hold that would be lifted if these projects fully spent the money that the city has been carrying forward for them, and also provided a progress report about ongoing projects. It appears we're getting some of those progress reports this week in Morales' committee. Councilmember Rivera has backed off on this idea of putting a hold on the funding. There's a lot of pushback from local groups who have been using this to build community centers, childcare facilities, etc. But David, I'm just kind of wondering what's next for EDI. Should these community groups be concerned? Do you see this funding as safe after all that community pushback? Or what's the future for EDI up against a $250 million budget deficit that's looming over the city right now?
Yeah, I don't think the council itself is going to revisit EDI in the same way that it did before. They got to this place where they basically agreed to have somebody do a report on EDI, and I think that was a way to for the council to basically withdraw what they were doing before without saying they're withdrawing it. That said, I think we're seeing some fairly major possible budget cuts depending on how things shake out, particularly for departments like OPCD, which administers the EDI program. And so I wouldn't say anyone should feel safe, but I think I could apply that to basically any program in the whole city. So I think at this point it's a generalized uneasiness rather than the council specifically targeting EDI as they were doing before.
Got it. And I've seen a lot of different good local reporting on this. Josh Cohen wrote about this in Crosscut, and he pointed out that with the mayor's hiring freeze, which was put in place at the start of the year, any requests for proposals, these RFPs, any of those over $1 million, they're really on hold at the moment, and this includes EDI projects. And I was just trying to think this through, what it's like for these different groups who are waiting for the city to figure out the budget plan here. And I know this is a yearly challenge for any group looking to get funding from the city, but we have some new council members who are learning the job. I'm trying to figure out how this budget process is going to go, looking at it from the perspective of these EDI providers. I wonder what kind of concerns are going through their heads.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. I think, we saw this with the library hours too, which is they just don't know what to do until the budget comes around. And I think a lot of staff in the city are probably feeling that way, which is, in some ways, they don't know exactly what their jobs are right now because they don't know what is going to continue to be greenlit or not. And I think it's a good point that applies to the EDI program as well. I think it's kind of a citywide feeling.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. It's just a lot of different programs that there are some question marks around them, I think is probably the best way to put it right now. But we'll see what happens with these projects. Again, that update for these EDI projects in terms of their progress, that is happening this week in the Land Use Committee. So we'll see what Councilmember Morales has to say about that. All right. Well, coming up next, some businesses in West Seattle have been voicing their concerns about light rail. They're not trying to stop its expansion necessarily, but they are shedding light on a part of this transit project you might not be fully aware of. We're going to dive in on Now Hear This. Well, at the end of last week, a group of West Seattle businesses came together for what they called a rally for relocation, talking about the reality of needing to move their businesses or close up shop when light rail comes through as planned in the year 2032. One business owner, Laura Trujillo of Ounces Tap Room, one of dozens of businesses that would have to relocate or close, voiced her concerns about this planned route, which will be finalized with an environmental impact statement later on this year. And she's talking a lot about how businesses are getting reimbursed.
There are currently 68 total businesses that will be forced to move if this current route is approved to West Seattle. And the stark reality is that the funding just isn't there. They're not providing us with that funding to successfully relocate, and that's what we want to share with our community.
David, I wanted to talk about this with you because what I'm hearing from business owners like this is really challenging. They say they're not against light rail. Trujillo herself said she voted for it, would love to see it come to West Seattle. But they're really concerned that they could be pushed out of business with this whole reimbursement process. How do you see this battle shaping up? This is really difficult for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, I had actually visited this location where they are planning to do the station. It was probably a year ago. At the end of the day, and I think pretty much any Sound Transit board member will tell you this. There will always be this kind of conflict. They had a few options that they looked at for this spot, and the other ones, it was either some combination of they would have had to basically uproot a lot of people from their homes, quite a few people, to put a station, or there was concerns about the angle that the actual trains would be taking, or if you go to the area, you can see why passing through it maybe makes sense for development. That said, the fact that there's this tap room and I think kind of most specifically this daycare there.
Yeah.
Nucor Steel there has also been raising concerns about a light rail station there. So there's kind of nothing but sympathy for these business owners because it is tough.
It's going to cause a problem no matter where you put a station there, I guess.
If somebody wants to argue there should be no light rail, that's one thing. If the stance is there should be light rail, it's always gonna follow with, well, okay, then where are we gonna put it? And that's always gonna have somebody who doesn't want it there.
Yeah. And I guess the other part that I found interesting was this concern some businesses have brought up about, hey, is this really going to happen in the next few years? Is it going to be 5 years from now? Is it going to be 8 years from now? What's going on? Because planning for the future gets really tough in a situation like that. And I definitely hate to bring this up, but we had a Seattle monorail project that spent $125 million of taxpayer money 20 years ago and never got off the ground. So I know that light rail and Sound Transit, they have a much better track record here. But do you think this 2032 completion date for West Seattle expansion of light rail is real? And I'm thinking about it from a business perspective or just the average person waiting to see it happen.
Not at the pace that they're moving. The fact that we are still having these conversations about where this thing should go, when we passed this package in 2016, this was 2 presidential terms ago that this was passed.
Ancient history, right?
And the board is still having debates over station location. Of course, there was always going to be a delay because it takes time to collect the amount of money you need and do all the bonding. But the Sound Transit Board has been admonished by outside experts for this kind of endless revisiting and restudying of decisions. And it hasn't, the message has not sunk in. They're still doing this kind of work. We saw it kind of with stations in South Lake Union and around Westlake and stuff like that.
Got it. Thank you very much for that, David. I wanted to make sure I touched on some other interesting news that was released recently about crime rates overall going down in the state of Washington. The Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs put out its annual report about this and showed that violent crimes decreased by 5.5%, property crimes went down close to 12%, murders down 5.8%. On the flip side, we had some vehicle thefts up by 5.4%. There was a jump in so-called vice crimes involving drugs and prostitution. Hate crimes, unfortunately, took a jump too. I just wanted to throw this out there, David. Did anything surprise you about those numbers?
I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I think I haven't gone too deep in it. I think we're seeing this nationally. Crime is coming down. And when crime went up in Seattle, that was happening nationally too. And so... not to say even at all that there isn't kind of a local role here, but it is important to keep that in context when talking about crime, which is these are large trends. I do think the pandemic gets lost in this a lot, which is there's fairly perfect correlation between crime rates and the pandemic, which, went way up and now it's been sort of slowly coming back down. So, that said, there's still reasons for concern.
Certainly in Seattle, where the number of shootings is very high still.
That is, some of the most serious crime and what people often care the most about.
Fair enough. And I wanted to throw out another stat to kind of keep in mind here. For the 13th year in a row, Washington State had the lowest number of law enforcement officers per capita, with just 1.35 commissioned officers per 1,000 residents. This is something that WASPIC, the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, has really been harping on. The national average is 2.31. So I wanted to look at that number too, because I think this is a really interesting trend for the state of Washington. What does that number say to you, David? That's a really interesting stat.
Yeah, I would imagine. Well, we know that law enforcement at the Washington State Patrol, for example, is way down from where they want it to be. But I would guess, and I don't know this, I'm just kind of hypothesizing, that a lot of that is driven by Seattle, because Seattle is by far the largest department, and it's something like 500 down from where it would like to be.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and even before the numbers at the Seattle Police Department started going down, Seattle
had fewer officers per capita than a lot of big cities.
You can take that as you want, but if you're looking at ratios,
Washington State was already pretty low.
Yeah, and we've had plenty of growth here too. So that those are two numbers that are kind of chasing each other there for sure. All right, well, thank you very much for that, David. I wanted to talk about something with you coming up here. Why are City Light customers seeing a bigger than expected bump in their utility bills? David took a close look at this issue. We're going to talk about what's happening coming up on What's Next. Well, a quick note to our patrons. We love doing the You Ask, We Answer segment here, where patrons send in questions. We need more people to send them in. Please email us at seattlenewsviewsandbrews@gmail.com. Spell it all out, and we will work on answering the questions you might have. Please and thank you. But David, I wanted to talk about this piece that you recently wrote for the Seattle Times about increasing city light rates for utility customers out there. I brought this up briefly on the podcast a few weeks ago, but I really appreciated the deeper dive you did on this. So these rates are going up 5.4% for each of the next 2 years, then 5% per year after that through the year 2030. This is more than originally forecast, as you pointed out, and a pretty significant jump after a few decades of relatively stable energy prices. So what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to supply and demand, really, and demand is going up for several reasons, and supply is, I mean, it is going down. It is also just becoming harder to obtain. And so, for various reasons. So, I mean, that kind of leads you to higher prices. I mean, that on a more detailed level, of course we know that Seattle is growing, so that's going to increase demand. But the forecasts for how much energy people would use in Seattle are being sort of revised upwards, in part because, honestly, for pushes for electrification of buildings and cars, and from a climate perspective, that's all good stuff. It does mean that people are likely to continue to use more energy going into the future. Complicating that, at the same time, the City Lights dams, which are, of course, we all enjoy fairly clean hydroelectricity, but when there are droughts and there's not as much water, those dams can't put out as much power. Typically the City Light then goes onto the market. They go and buy power from Bonneville Power Administration, which has dams on Columbia River, but they also need to kind of go out into the free market, the larger market, and compete with other Western states for that power. And we're in a place now where, states, especially West Coast states, have largely committed to being carbon neutral and not using fossil fuels to power its cities. Mm-hmm. Again, from a climate perspective, a good thing, but it means the competition for those resources has gone way up. At the same time, weather events that affect Washington tend to affect other states. So if we're in drought conditions, they're probably in drought conditions also. And then, on top of that, the cost of labor goods has gone way up. All of these factors converging.
You mentioned the average cost per megawatt hour for City Light has more than doubled in just the past 4 years.
The result is we're all paying more for electricity.
Wow. And you mentioned this, and maybe just to build on what you were just saying, City Light is saying it's going to need some additional resources, essentially, to meet this growing demand for power, and it's needing to be carbon free. Are they going to be looking towards other solar power ideas, or wind power, or maybe something out in the waters of the Pacific Ocean? I'm not quite sure where this goes, but where are they going to find that power? Any thoughts there? Any ideas?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting thing to watch, actually. So they say that they have signed an agreement for to put solar panels in Eastern Oregon, which is interesting. And they also have intention to expand into wind and, I think, geothermal, which frankly I don't entirely understand how that works. But regardless, it's this utility has been basically 100% hydro, be it its own hydro or the hydro generated on the Columbia River. And so the fact that they're talking about creating their own new resources rather than just saying we're going to go buy more clean energy, the fact that they're talking about actually adding new infrastructure and having new City Light kind of producers is pretty fascinating, actually, and something that the utility has never done before.
Yeah, and you talked with the new CEO there, Dawn Lindell. What's she like? What's her vision looking like? What was your take on talking with her?
Yeah, I mean, she's in a pretty good position. She was just sworn in, so that when you come into a department facing challenging times, as a new CEO, you get a little bit of a honeymoon period. And so I think that's where she is right now, which is she's being, and it also allows her to be kind of brutally honest about the situation, because there's nothing, she's coming into this new. And so she understands, I think, what the utility is facing. It's, I think the CFO said in the council meeting that it's a concern, not a crisis just yet. But the underlying pressures that we're talking about here, I think, do have a sort of existential nature to them, because we're not just talking about one bad year. We're talking about sort of a trend over time that is forcing these rates upward. And, ironically, it wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 2017. People weren't spending enough on power, and so their revenues were down, and that was causing its own headaches. Kind of opposite is likely to be true now, which is the demand is high enough and the supply just can't keep up. And I think it will require some expansion into either markets that they have not explored before, or infrastructure that they haven't dipped their toes into before. Really
interesting. I'm with you. That search for new energy and where it's going to happen is the quest for the Northwest, and I guess the entire country and the world when you think about it there, and in terms of how that's all going to break down. But very glad to read that piece, David, and thanks for breaking down those different parts with me there. But I do need to wrap up with it, sir. And I noticed that a post you had recently, you were talking about an organized sports activity with your kid. First time you've experienced that. Are you feeling traumatized? How you doing, man? What do we got?
Organized is a overly optimistic
generous term
for what that was. We signed our 1.5-year-old up for soccer, and he managed to kind of kick the ball around a little bit and do a little bit. It was a half an hour thing. He made it like 20 minutes, which is pretty good. So,
that's awesome for a kid of 1.5, man. You get parent of the year for that. Wow.
and then he got sad and wanted to be done. So where his Major League Soccer career is on hold for now, but
blossoming. And have they roped you into coach yet or anything like that? What's cooking there?
Yeah, well, I mean, at that age, basically each kid has their parent with them the whole time. This is not a free for all. There's one person sort of saying what to do, and then a parent being their kid through the activities. So he doesn't get full credit for making it 20 minutes.
Fair. No, every parent is a coach on those situations for sure. And it's kind of following around that one mass of kids with a ball in the middle.
We're not even at that level yet.
I remember those days well. So, thank you very much, David, as always. Thanks to everybody listening to this episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews. This is the podcast where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks especially to patrons who support the show. If you want to be a patron, find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. And again, please do consider supporting the show as a patron. Thanks for watching on Converge Media as well. We will see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.